The house was quiet. Too quiet. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the clock were the only sounds filling the kitchen, stretching the silence between each passing second. The night air was warm, thick, the heat from the stove still lingering in the air as I wiped down the counter, my movements slow, unhurried. I should have gone upstairs already. Should have turned off the lights, climbed into bed, let the evening fade into the background. But something kept me here. Maybe it was the weight of the silence, or maybe it was something else entirely. And then I heard it. The low creak of the floorboards behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. "You're up late," he murmured, his voice cutting through the quiet, smooth and easy. I swallowed, setting down the dishcloth, my fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "So are you." A low chuckle, soft but edged with something deeper. "Couldn't sleep." I finally turned then, my gaze meeting his across the kitchen. He stood just inside the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, one hand tucked into the pocket of his pants, the other holding a half-empty glass of something dark. The dim glow from the under-cabinet lights cast sharp angles along his jaw, catching the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Whiskey?" I asked, nodding toward the glass. "Helps me think." I arched a brow. "About what?" His smirk deepened. "A lot of things." I exhaled, shaking my head as I turned back toward the counter, reaching for my own glass of water. "Not sure that's the best way to clear your head." He took a slow sip, watching me over the rim. "Depends on what I'm trying to clear it of." Something about the way he said it sent a slow shiver down my spine. I felt his gaze trailing over me, lingering just a second too long before flicking away again. The air in the kitchen felt heavier now, different, charged with something unspoken. I should have walked away. Instead, I stayed. "You always this restless?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "Not always." Another beat of silence, stretching between us like a slow pull of gravity, something I couldn't quite fight against. I could feel the weight of his stare, steady and waiting, the kind of gaze that wasn't just passing curiosity, but something else entirely. "You sure your husband doesn't mind you staying down here?" he murmured, tilting his head slightly. My fingers tightened around my glass. "Why would he?" His smirk was small, amused, but his voice was softer now. "No reason. Just seems like you're waiting for something." My pulse ticked up, heat curling low in my stomach. "And what exactly do you think I'm waiting for?" A pause, a slow exhale, and then, "You tell me." The weight of his words settled between us, thick, expectant. I should have ended this conversation, should have turned back toward the sink, let the moment pass before it became something I wasn't ready to name. But instead, I held his gaze. And I knew then. This wasn't over. Not even close. The tension stretched between us, neither of us breaking the silence, neither of us moving. The soft hum of the kitchen appliances became a backdrop, drowned out by the sound of my own breathing, steady but shallow. He shifted his weight slightly, his fingers tightening around the glass in his hand before setting it down on the counter beside him. "You always clean this late?" he asked, his voice dipping lower, smoother. I huffed a quiet laugh, shaking my head. "Not usually." "Then what is it?" he pressed, his head tilting slightly. "Something keeping you up?" I swallowed, gripping the edge of the counter. "Maybe." His smirk returned, slow and knowing. I figured. The space between us shrank, not physically, but in a way that felt just as tangible. The awareness between us, thick and pressing, made the kitchen feel smaller, the air heavier. My fingers flexed slightly against the cool marble surface beneath them, grounding myself against something I wasn't entirely ready to name. I could have turned away. I should have. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed rooted in place, my breath slower now, my skin tingling under the weight of his gaze. "You ever wonder what it would be like?" he murmured suddenly, voice barely above a whisper. My stomach tightened. "What?" His eyes never left mine. If things were different. A slow inhale. A pause too long to be innocent. I let my lips part slightly, my breath catching at the implication behind his words. I knew what he meant. He wasn't talking about late-night kitchen conversations or whiskey-induced thoughts. He was talking about something else. something we weren't supposed to talk about. And yet, here we were. My throat tightened, my mind screaming at me to steer this back into safer waters, to laugh it off, to pretend this wasn't happening. But my body, the way my pulse quickened, the way my skin prickled with awareness, told a different story. "You shouldn't say things like that," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. His smirk didn't waver. Why not? Because if he kept going, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stop. The weight of his words hung in the air between us, thick, almost suffocating. The hum of the kitchen lights seemed louder now, every small sound amplified by the silence that stretched between us. I could still feel the ghost of his last question, lingering in the space between my ribs, curling low in my stomach. If things were different, I knew exactly what he meant. And I knew exactly why I hadn't shut it down the moment he said it. My fingers curled slightly around the edge of the counter, grounding myself against something I wasn't sure I could control anymore. "You shouldn't say things like that." His smirk didn't falter. If anything, it deepened. "Why not?" I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Because we both know where this leads." He took a step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, the kind that gave me plenty of time to step away, to put space between us before the inevitable could happen. But I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My skin felt too warm, my pulse hammering against my throat as I watched him close the gap inch by inch. "Do we?" he murmured, his voice lower now, quieter. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat drowning out every rational thought I had left. Yes! Another step. Close enough now that I could smell the whiskey on his breath, the faint trace of something warm and familiar beneath it. "And is that what you want?" The question sent a slow shiver through me, curling deep in my stomach, making my breath hitch before I could stop it. My fingers flexed against the countertop, nails pressing into the cool marble surface. "It doesn't matter what I want," I whispered. His smirk faded slightly, replaced by something else. Something heavier. "Doesn't it?" The space between us was almost non-existent now. Just a breath, just a hesitation, just a single moment separating us from something we couldn't take back. My mind screamed at me to turn away. But my body had already made its decision. The air between us pulsed, thick with something electric, something undeniable. I should have stepped away, should have ended this before it spiraled beyond my control. But I didn't. Because deep down I knew. I didn't want to.